as the Russia-Ukraine war has been dragging on for several months now. We from Affluent Millionaires and Billionaires felt compelled to share our views on the situation. Specifically, we were considering how this war might end. Having sparred with some very interesting people, we feel like we have several realistic outcomes for our viewers to consider. That is exactly what this video is all about. Please remember hitting the subscribe button and notification bell if you'd like to stay updated on the subject. Speaking off, here are the 7 ways we feel like this war might end. Number 1. Putin must be removed from office. To be honest, number 1 was actually Victory Day. However, Victory Day has passed and the war didn't end. So we can scratch that one off the list. While public approval numbers for Putin paint him as a popular leader, it is difficult to know exactly how popular he truly is. Autocracies aren't exactly known for eliciting truthful responses from their citizens. If Putin were actually unpopular, this could lead to his removal from office in a few ways, such as a widely joined protest could unexpectedly arise, possibly overwhelming security forces and storming government buildings. A single unhappy individual with good connections could assassinate him. Or a more organized group of disaffected politicians and generals could initiate a coup d'état to remove Putin from office. The working theory here is that his replacement would then remove Russian troops from the war and build a fresh regime free from the burdens of the floundering conflict. Number 2. Putin gambles for resurrection. Ending the war on May 9th would have meant Putin accepting the holdings as they were, but clearly that wasn't enough. A settlement is only as good as a leader's ability to politically survive it. Let's go back to World War I. By the end, it was clear that Germany was very likely to lose and that a settlement would be better for all countries involved. Nevertheless, Germany continued to fight. The problem was that Germany was not ready to make the democratic concessions that the settlement would have entailed, being the autocratic regime that it was. Erich Ludendorff, a member of the de facto military dictatorship, described that the hypothetical granting of equal enfranchisement would be worse than a lost war. He subsequently increased his demands against the opponents. Despite being on the losing side, Ludendorff held on to the idea that if Germany makes peace without profit, Germany will have lost the war. His preferred view of Germany, that is. Political scientists call this gambling for resurrection, and one might argue this is the case with Russia today. If Putin is politically vulnerable, which is very hard to conclude from the outside, then he may find the war's current progress to be insufficient for settlement negotiations. This would mean a longer war that either ends after Putin conquers more territory or continued Russian military defeats and a political disaster for Putin at home. Number 3. Negotiated settlement. It's also possible that Putin is not facing much domestic pressure at home after all. From the Russian perspective, this is still a special military operation, not a war. If so, both Ukraine and Russia would be better off thinking about what the eventual outcome of the war would be. Perhaps something like this as a hypothetical and just implementing that without continuing the war to its bitter end. This would give them exactly what they would anticipate receiving if they continue to fight. Except the soldiers that might otherwise die in the process would survive instead, as we've discussed before. However, such agreements require consensus on what the eventual outcome should be. If Ukraine thinks the eventual division would look like this, but Russia thinks that the eventual division should look like this, then negotiations won't work out. Number 4. Zelensky must be eliminated. This at least was Putin's hope at the start of the war. Reports indicate that a Russian strike team tried to parachute in on Kiev to storm the presidential compound and take out Zelensky. In theory, without a head of state to rally around, the rest of Ukraine would have immediately folded. That plot clearly failed. And at this point, a successful assassination attempt would seem unlikely to lead to a quick end to the war. In Ukraine, the past couple of months turned a relatively unpopular Ukrainian president into a national political hero. Assassinating Zelensky, arresting him or whatever might even backfire now, as it would only turn him into a martyr for Ukraine's cause. So likely we can scratch that one off the list. Number 5. The West has to accept the military defeat of Ukraine. Ukraine's military defeat seemed inevitable to many at the beginning of the war. But Russia's poor logistics, especially in the western half of Ukraine, suddenly made the former superpower look very mortal. Russia is learning from its mistakes and has reoriented itself to focus on the east. It's still plausible that the Russian army defeats Ukraine's military, even if it might take a lot longer than Putin initially thought. The lingering question is what Russia would do next? Was the entire point of the war just to secure ties to the Russian-speaking portions of Ukraine, and was the initial attack on Kiev simply a feint? Or is Putin willing to pay the cost to administer the entire country over the long term, and that first assault on the capital was not a feint but a failure? We still don't really know, and we may never find out, absent Ukraine suffering a complete military collapse. Number 6. Ukraine will be destroyed. It's also possible that Putin's motivation for the war has nothing to do with Ukraine itself, but it's rather a renewal of Cold War era. East-West tensions, NATO has drifted westward over time, and Putin might fear that Ukraine joining the fold would give the United States a newfound military advantage over Russia. This is the preventive war motivation for the conflict, which we have previously covered. One way preventive wars end is when the underlying source of the power shift is no longer possible. If Ukraine is no longer capable of arming itself or becoming a meaningful alliance partner, Russia has no need to continue the war. At that point, there is a lot of variation in what this could mean, and those differences are substantial. From Ukraine's perspective, an economy in shambles is one thing. The use of low-level nuclear weapons is another. Number 7. World War III. The good news is that we think that this option is very unlikely, or at least less likely than the other options discussed in this video. As bad as things are now, they are nothing like the peak of the Cold War. This isn't the Cuban Missile Crisis when the world ground to a halt, thinking that the world might come to an end at any point. That might be of little comfort to you. After all, if World War III did start, it would be the worst thing to ever happen to humanity. Russia has over 6,000 nuclear weapons. The United States has about 5,500 nuclear weapons. Both of these numbers are substantially greater than the third on the list, as China has only 350. The good news is that these figures are well below the historical highs of 39 million in 1985. The bad news is that there are still way more than necessary to destroy all of humanity. It is unlikely that either party would willingly start World War III. The problem is that accidents or misunderstandings can happen. For example, back in 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 was heading from Anchorage to Seoul. The flight was supposed to avoid Soviet airspace. Instead, a navigational error put it directly over the Soviet Union Moscow, scrambling some interceptors which then shot down the plane. Everyone on board died, including a US congressman who just so happened to be on the flight. Tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States soared. And just 3 weeks later, an early warning alert system outside of Moscow detected an incoming missile. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed and this didn't spiral out of control. World War III had not yet started. That was it for today. Thank you for watching, and we hope no more innocent souls will get hurt during this war. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more news about affluent millionaires and billionaires.